Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be in Berlin. It's one of my favorite towns, cities in the world. I'm grateful to the CMO, to Sonia and to Mark, my colleague and friend, for inviting me. It's a big honor, and I'm very grateful, Mark, for your very gracious introduction. This is an auspicious moment for me to present this work, because I'm between two projects. As Mark said, the book on Zionism appeared, and I've started work on this book that, for the moment, tentatively I'm entitling The Culture of Settler Societies, within which Israel and Zionism will figure, but it will not be as monographic as the previous. What I want to talk about today is the Zionist colonization of Palestine in the context of comparative settler colonialism. I'd like to present my argument in two steps. I shall first give a succinct account of what comparative settler colonialism is all about, and place the Zionist Israeli project within that context. In the second step, I shall dwell on two major Zionist figures, Chaim Arlozorov and Arthur Rupin, and show that the consciousness evinced by their intellectual and political work was one of white settlers. I think that the best way deeply to understand Zionism and the state of Israel is comparative settler colonialism. The buoyant field of comparative settler colonialism has produced some of the most penetrating new studies of these societies over the past few decades. Their starting point is the recognition that from the 16th century on, European expansion and conquest produced two related but clearly distinguishable forms of colonialism. One was metropole colonialism, in which the European powers conquered and ruled vast territories, but without the emigration there of Europeans seeking to make these territories their national home. British India is a good example. The other type was settler colonialism, in which conquest brought with it substantial waves of European settlers who, with the passage of time, sought to make the colony their national patrimony. This process entailed a relationship with the indigenous people that could range from dispossession to elimination, or from slavery, which for the most part did not use the native population, to cheap labor, depending on the economic and social formation of the given settler situation. The achievements of the comparative study of settler colonialism have been at once scholarly and political. Many settler projects gave birth to powerful nation-states, which have asserted their hegemonic narratives nationally and internationally. The comparative field not only acutely questions these narratives through countervailing evidence and interpretation, it also offers an alternative, transformative account of the social formations themselves. In the process, three fundamental features common to these hegemonic settler narratives are undermined. The first of these is the putative uniqueness of each settler nation. The second, their privileging of the settler nations, their privileging of the settlers' intentions as sovereign subjects at the expense of the native consciousness and at the expense of the consequences of colonization. Third is the supposed inconsequence of natives to the form each settler society takes. In other words, the conflict with the natives is not denied, but the fundamental role that this conflict has played in shaping the identity of the settler nation is written out. It is within the typology of settler colonialism that I place the Zionist colonization of Palestine and the State of Israel, a move which surely should put to rest the tedious contention that Zionism could not be termed a colonial venture because it lacked the features of metropole colonialism, as if anyone were suggesting otherwise. What Zionist apologists fail to confront is the settler colonial paradigm. I am by no means the first to suggest it. The pioneer analyst of Zionist Israel as a settler project was the late Baruch Kimmerling's Zionism and Territory in 1983. Kimmerling was a sociologist of the Hebrew University. A decade later, in his magisterial Land, Labor, and the Origins of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, Gershon Shafir, another Israeli sociologist who has been teaching for a long time at UCSD, Gershon Shafir brought the method of comparative settler colonialism to bear upon the early phase of Zionist colonization from 1882 to 1914, and later upon the nature of the Israeli state itself. Shafir demonstrated that although certain features were historically specific to Zionism, it is nonetheless perfectly comparable to other settler projects, and that what shaped the nature and institutions of the Jewish colonization of Palestine were not just the project's intrinsic ideologies, but the settler-indigene struggle itself. Shafir underscored the distinction between metropole and settler colonialisms and helped to refine the taxonomy of the latter, of settler colonialism. In particular, he distinguished two types of settler colonies: the plantation, which he aptly adapts to the context of Palestine by calling it ethnic plantation, and the pure settlement colony. The plantation type prevailed in the first phase of Zionist immigration and colonization, known as the First Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, which saw the arrival of 20 to 30,000 immigrants. Informed by the model of French Algeria and guided by the Rothschilds technocrats, it was a social formation in which, from a settler vantage point, what was needed from the natives was both land and cheap labor. With the arrival of the second phase of Zionist immigration, the second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, some 35 to 40,000 immigrants, the crucial passage from plantation to pure settlement occurred in a process that Shafir meticulously documented and interpreted with great insight. The second Aliyah's revolution against the first Aliyah, Shafir observes, I quote him, did not originate from opposition to settler colonialism as such, but out of frustration with the inability of the ethnic plantation colony to provide sufficient employment for Jewish workers, i.e., from opposition to the particular form of their predecessors' colonization. The second Aliyah's own method of settlement, and subsequently the dominant Zionist method, was but another type of European overseas colonization, the pure settlement colony, also found in Australia and northern US and elsewhere. Its threefold was control of land, employment that ensured European standards of living, and massive immigration. This form of pure settlement rested on two exclusivist pillars: on the World Zionist Organization's Jewish National Fund, the JNF, and on the Histadrut, which I won't explain now, but we may talk about it in the discussion time if you are interested. The aims of the JNF and the Histadrut were the removal of land and labor from the market, respectively, thus closing them off to Palestinian Arabs. End of quote. What I suggest is that my work may be seen as supplementing Shafir's by adding an analysis of the superstructure to his penetrating account of the base. This suggestion is informed by Althusser's and Perry Anderson's insistence that the variety of social formations throughout history is the result of a dynamic interaction between base and superstructure rather than a mechanistic reflection of the former by the latter, which is the type of analysis that orthodox mechanistic Marxism used to be engaged in. I begin from the assumption that if the land-labor formation in Israel has been so palpably typical of settler societies, there is likely to be a corresponding superstructure. The second part of my talk will shortly demonstrate this crucial point by looking at the consciousness of two leading Zionist figures. Comparative settler colonialism is a sine qua non for not only a proper understanding of the past, but also of the present perfect. Here the work of the Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe has been pivotal. The originality and insight of Wolfe's writings on this issue lie in his appreciative critique of anti-colonial writers like Emile Cabral and Frantz Fanon, and later ones like Gabriel Piterberg. For all the homage paid to heterogeneity and difference, Wolfe observes, the bulk of, I'm quoting him now, the bulk of post-colonial theorizing is disabled by an oddly monolithic and surprisingly unexamined notion of colonialism. One of the sources for this monolithic view of colonialism, he argues, Wolfe, quote, consists in the historical accident, or is it, that the native founders of the post-colonial canon came from franchise or dependent as opposed to settler or Creole colonies. This gave these guerrilla theoreticians the advantage of speaking to an oppressed majority on the supply of whose labor a colonizing minority was vulnerably dependent. But what if the colonizers are not dependent on native labor? Indeed, what if the natives themselves have been reduced to a small minority whose survival can hardly be seen to furnish the colonizing society with more than a remission from ideological embarrassment? Unquote. Wolff attributes decisive explanatory significance to the fact that, in contrast to the colonial formation that Cabral or Fanon confronted, settler colonies, quote, were not primarily established to extract surplus value from indigenous labor. Rather, they were premised on displacing the indigents from or replacing them on the land. This created a situation in which it was difficult to speak of an articulation between colonizer and native, since the determinate articulation is not to a society but directly to the land, a precondition of social organization. Unquote. The bottom line is a formulation that Wolff reiterates on several occasions, one that other scholars of settler colonialism understandably cite. I quote again Wolff: settler colonies are premised on the elimination of native societies. The split tensing are reflects a determinate feature of settler colonization. The colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. Unquote. Successful settler projects that have become powerful settler nation states in many ways continue to behave as if they were still a settler project. Israel is a leading example. There are two main threads of continuity from the frontier colonization phase to that of statehood. The first is the continuing process of acquiring growing portions of land while simultaneously expanding the Palestinians or enclosing them in decreasing isolated spaces. The second is the ongoing buttressing through laws, institutions, or coercive mechanisms of what can be termed settler supremacy, or in this case, Judeo-supremacy. Like every settler society, Israel has its own historical specificities. The Shoah, the Holocaust, as a catastrophic event and as a lingering phenomenon with various consequences, is an obvious example. Two other related features are distinctly Zionist Israeli. The first is that as a settler ideology, it denies the nativeness of the natives even more completely than do more eliminatory instances such as Argentina, US, and Australia. The second is that this is ultimately an unresolved settler situation, which entails various paradoxes. On the one hand, the native Palestinian survival and presence play a much more substantial political role than, say, the Native Americans and the Aboriginals find themselves in the US and Australia, respectively. On the other hand, the asymmetry of power between the settler state and the indigents has grown exponentially. This paradox is volatile because, frustratingly from the vantage point of the settler state can neither translate this yawning power discrepancy into the irrevocable removal of the natives, nor can it resign itself to their presence as equal human beings, individually and collectively. I now move to discuss the first of the two Zionist figures, Chaim Arlosoroff, in what I call Chaim Arlosorov's exercise, of course in quotation marks, in comparative settler colonialism. Of course he didn't mean to conduct an exercise in that. While scores of pro-Zionist scholars and apologists have been at pains to suppress the degree to which the presence of the Palestinian Arabs was intrinsic to the nature of the Zionist project and the extent to which it essentially was a settler colonial project, a no less committed Zionist inadvertently manifested awareness of precisely that which would be later denied. This Zionist was Chaim Arlosoroff, 1899 to 1933, by far the intellectually brightest politician of note within labor Zionism. It is speculated that had his death not been untimely, he would have eclipsed Ben-Gurion. I myself doubt that Arlosoroff possessed either Ben-Gurion's knack for organization and mobilization of power or his utter ruthlessness. Dr. Chaim Arlosoroff is best, almost only known for his assassination in Tel Aviv on 16th June 1933. The assassins remain unidentified. He was then the maverick of Zionist politics, one of the leaders of the main labor party, Mapai, and head of the political department of the Jewish Agency, basically a foreign minister. Arlosoroff was amidst discussions with the Nazi leadership, which were meant to enable emigrating German Jews to salvage at least some of their wealth, provided their destination was Palestine. The right-wing revisionist agitation against the negotiations, and Arlosoroff personally, peaked at that time, though it has not been conclusively shown that the killers were revisionists. Chaim Victor Arlosoroff was born in 1899 in the Ukraine, to well-off middle-class parents who spoke both Russian and German. He studied Hebrew at home with a private tutor. The family fled to Königsberg in Germany in the wake of the 1905 revolution, and during World War I settled in Berlin. There, Arlosoroff became engrossed in two worlds: German letters and culture through the gymnasium he attended, and Zionism through Hapoel HaTzair, the Young Worker Party. The latter was an anti-Marxist and for the most part non-socialist party, which was inspired by the Tolstoyan religion of labor, developed by the early laborite settlers' father figure, A.D. Gordon. At the end of the war, he studied economics at Berlin University. In 1919, at the age of 20, he published his first work, Jewish People's Socialism, Der Jüdische Volkssozialismus, which in a way amalgamated his intellectual and political sources of inspiration: Marx, Kropotkin, Russian Narodnik moods, and German Romanticism. In 1923, he submitted his doctoral dissertation on Marx's concept of class and class struggle, and was offered a university position by his advisor, very famous German social scientist Werner Sombart. The offer was declined, and in 1924, Arlosoroff immigrated to Palestine. In 1927, Arlosoroff published a remarkable essay in Hebrew, which he entitled On the Question of Joint Organization, L'She'elat Ha'irgun HaMeshutaf. It appeared in Hapoel HaTzair's daily and was included in the collection of his works published shortly after the assassination. Let me first explain the context embodied in the title, The Question of Joint Organization. Although the Zionist settlers were successful in creating an exclusively Jewish labor market in their own economic sphere, they could not do so in that part of the economy which was controlled by the British mandatory state. Palestine was under British mandate, under British occupation from the end of the First World War to 1948. In the state-run railway and postal services, there developed a vigorous mixed labor market of Arab and Jewish workers who sought to unionize. The increasingly marginalized, but nonetheless lively, left-wing parties in the Histadrut, which was also a trade union, but not only a trade union, much more than that, was the state in the making, basically. Left-wing parties in the Histadrut tried to challenge the Zionist nature and Ben-Gurion's iron hand through the Railway Workers' Union, which was jointly Arab and Jewish. They called for a Histadrut that is based on a universally inclusive organization on the basis of class, instead of an exclusively Jewish one that is an arm of a settler society. By the late 1920s, Ben-Gurion defeated them in two steps. One, he first supported a joint organization, but crucially, one that was based on separate national divisions, Arab and Jewish. And by that, he, of course, completely subverted the true purpose of joint organization. Two, he co-opted the railway union into the Histadrut, and striking at an opportune moment, expelled the left from the Histadrut altogether. So basically, really, from the 1920s, late 1920s until today, if you will, there is no left. There has been no left in the Histadrut. The essay that contained Arlosrov's intervention in the joint organization debates demonstrates in an original way how instinctive the consciousness of white settlers had become with the leading labor Zionists. That essay was reacting not just to the context just charted, but also specifically to Ben-Gurion. Arlosrov distinguished his analysis from the hopelessly ideology-ridden positions of his colleagues, in his view of course, and recommended it for the scientific factuality as well as its comparative perspective. For Arlosrov, there was one, and only one, criterion by which the worthiness of joint organization ought to be judged. I quote, but the translations from Hebrew, by the way, are mine. It hasn't been translated into English. I quote, can the joint organization nullify the competition between the expensive and modern Hebrew labor and the cheap and primitive Arab labor, and thereby create more amenable conditions for the collective of Hebrew workers in their way for the conquest of labor? The answer to this question, rather than a preconceived doctrine, will determine our verdict on the method of joint organization. This clear formulation vindicates, first of all, Ze'ev Sternhell's thesis that what labor Zionism offered, in both practice and ideology, was nationalist socialism, almost completely devoid of any humanistic and universalist appeal or content. Arlosrov attributed no value whatsoever to joint organization, even in its pure settlement garb of autonomous ethnic sections, unless it could be shown to contribute to colonization of labor, in this case immigration, by guaranteeing wages that were commensurate with at least the more modest European economies and settlement. Developing a detailed analysis based on substantial economic data, in other words, it's quite an impressive essay. He argued that joint organization would not only fail to enhance the Zionist colonization of Palestine, but in certain respects it would even hinder it. Concerning wages, Arlosrov questioned the assumption that joint struggle would necessarily result in an upswing in the sphere of labor generated by the mandatory state. He maintained that in such struggles there was no uniform results, and wages would always depend on the nature of an actual national economy and its objective capacity. He first suggested a hypothetical, I emphasize hypothetical analogy for Palestine. The hypothetical analogy that could illustrate the futility of joint organization was the migration of a few tens of thousands of American or Australian workers. So note that even in the hypothetical example, he's actually using settler societies. So the migration of a few tens of thousands of American or Australian workers to Poland. When these American workers unionized, they would instantly face the competition of cheaper labor from the indigenous Polish worker. I quote Arlosrov, what would we say if these American workers seriously suggested to solve the problem by uniting with the Polish workers in order to obtain an American wage level? We would say that such a suggestion was to no avail. Unquote. Arlosrov's point was that inter-ethnic joint organization could work at different regions of national economies, but not at the type of economy Palestine represented. In the latter case, he pointed out, there are two economies that are simultaneously very different, yet porous to one another. These were what he called, it's his terms, the native economy and the settler economy. The former was a primitive Eastern economy, whereas the latter was a relatively advanced European one. Clearly then, Arlosrov put his weight behind the complete rejection of joint organization with the Arab workers. His preferred course of action was introduced in the latter part of the essay through analogy, but this time actual rather than hypothetical. I quote Arlosrov, I think it is worth trying to find an equivalent to our problem in the annals of settlement of other countries, and to explain our situation by deduction. This is not easy. There is hardly an example of this, the Zionist endeavor of a colonizing people with European level of needs, which does not resort to enforcement measures, and its purpose is to transform a country in which there is a low level of wages into a site of mass immigration and mass settlement, unquote. Arlosrov proceeds with the settler colonial examples that won't do for the particular question of the interaction of settler workers and native workers in the labor market. The US was not an adequate comparison, and neither were New Zealand and Australia again. Note how he's comparing all the time, he's comparing to settler situations. Now I quote him, since they nipped this problem in the bud through a fervent policy of white Australia, unquote. He then asserts that South Africa, I quote, is almost the only case in which there is sufficient similarity in the objective conditions and problems so as to allow us an analogy. To prevent misunderstanding in advance, it should be stressed that we know full well also the difference of the factors at work in the two countries' condition, and that we do not wish to attempt here to create an analogous political construction, but only to compare to one another the polar points in the two countries' economy, unquote. So he thinks that the relevant equivalent case to compare or analogous is South Africa. Comparably to Palestine, Al-Losroff maintained, in South Africa of the late 19th century and early decades of the 20th century, there emerged a labor market that consisted of a minority of white workers who were unable to compete with the vast majority of Asian and African workers, and whose material expectations and needs were much higher. The gaps were especially substantial, Al-Losroff says, and greater than between Jews and non-Jews in Palestine, between its Easterns, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Bantu Negroes. Thus, the problem was even more serious in South Africa than in Palestine. Eventually, the solution came to be the color bar laws, which we can discuss later if you want, which were introduced as a result of the political weight of the South African Labour Party and trade unions, just like in Palestine. These laws excluded all non-Europeans from the skilled, supervisory and better paid labour, and preserved that domain for Europeans only. Al-Losroff remarks that, quote, it is not important whether we reject this politics or justify it. It is important here to highlight the economic reasons and social relations that led, rightly or wrongly, to the promulgation of color bar laws, unquote. Al-Losroff's conclusion issued from the South African analogy, which he described, and from an article he had read by Lord Sidney Oliver, in which he recommended, Sidney Oliver, an absolute separation, segregation, he called it, of whites and blacks. Al-Losroff asserted that in the forthcoming decades, the only way to achieve the fulfillment of Zionism would be completely to forsake any notion of joint organization, joint anything really, and stiffen the separation into two economies, one modern, well-paid and conducive to an enhanced immigration of settlers, and the other undeveloped and low-paid, which would enable the settlers continuously to exclude the indigenous workers from their labor market. I move now to Arthur Rupp in the final section of my talk through what I call a note on the genealogy of early Zionist settlement. Common knowledge has it that the kibbutz originated from an astonishing socialist experimentation with an ideology the settlers, who were called pioneers or chalutzim in Hebrew, had acquired in Europe. Even someone as astutely prophetic and sober as Hannah Arendt thought that the kibbutzim were marvelous. That this rendering accords the settlers not only with a central role but also hyper-agency is hardly surprising, for these settlers were members of the second and third aliyahs, that is, the ruling political elite of the Zionist, early Zionist community, the Yishuv, from the 20s onward, the World Zionist Organization and Jewish Agency from the 30s on, and the State of Israel from 1948 to 1977. I wish seriously to question this story and offer a threefold correction. Temper the hyper-agency of the settlers by underscoring the pivotal role played by the German Jewish settlement experts. 2, show that the decisive factor was the conditions and desire of colonization, rather than any simple ideologies, utopian ideologies from Europe. And 3rd, show that even in terms of ideational flow from Europe to Palestine, what we have is ideas of colonization and race, rather than socialism. In the mid-1980s, two geographers of the Hebrew University, Shalom Reichman and Shlomo Hasson, published a revealing article on the formative influence of the colonization project of the German Reich prior to the First World War in the Posen, or Poznan in Polish, province in the East Prussian Marches upon the early phase of the Zionist colonization effort in Palestine. Not little part of the East Prussian Marches, or the Ostmark, was taken in the partitioning of Poland in the late 18th century. In the latter decades of the 19th century, three of the Ostmark provinces, Eastern and Western Prussia and Silesia, had a German majority. Only the fourth, Posen, had a Polish majority of roughly 60%. Posen was also identified by the Germans as a center of Polish nationalism. The wider background of this project was the crisis of German agriculture and the attendant Landflucht that emanated from it. The purpose of the state project was to effect a demographic transformation in Posen, first and foremost, and the Ostmark more generally, by dispossessing the Polish majority of its hold on the land and settling Germans in their stead. The process began in 1886 with the promulgation of the colonization law by the Prussian Diet and the creation of the main instrument to implement its intention, namely the Colonization Commission. Its main task was to purchase large portions of land from especially the big German and Polish landowners and financially facilitate the establishment of small and medium-sized German colonies. A fund of 100 million marks was provided and was regularly refilled in the next 2 decades. The German method of settlement, Reichman and Hasson elaborate, was intended to produce a new space that on the one hand would check the geographical expansion of the Poles and on the other would strengthen the German presence in the area. To attain this goal, the German Colonization Commission embarked on a comprehensive program that included land purchasing, planning and development, land parceling, selling and renting land to German colonists, and provision of administrative services and guidelines for new colonists. Of crucial importance for this discussion is the attitude to labor. The Commission subdivided the large estates it had purchased into 2 types of colonies. One was the farm, in which each settler received an area of 10 to 15 hectares, and the other was the working people's colony, where settlers were apportioned allotments of half to 1.5 hectares for garden produce, but they were employed in nearby cities. In other words, they didn't basically live off agriculture. As for the first type of colony, the farm, the main principle underlying the choice of this size was that it would provide for the subsistence of one family without the help of hired labor. This was intended to prevent the employment of Polish labor in areas settled by Germans. In other words, the logic of the pure settlement colony again. The German colonization project was ultimately unsuccessful, for although it purchased substantial tracts of land and settled large numbers of Germans, it could neither transform the Ostmarks, especially Posen's demography, nor remove the Poles. The latter, creating their own institutions, fought back effectively, and the former's immigration to the area, the Germans' immigration to the area and settlement in it, was offset by emigration from it. The German project and the Colonization Commission as an institution, as an agency, had formative impact upon the Zionist project in 4 related ways. It brought upon the irrevocable discarding of the French model that had been introduced by the Rothschild experts. It accorded primacy to national colonization over economic profitability. It accorded primacy to an equivalent of the state and its bureaucracy over the market and private capitalists. It implanted in the World Zionist Organization what Shafir perceptively calls the pure settlement frame of mind. The agents of this formative impact were 2 German Jewish settlement experts, Franz Oppenheimer, 1864 to 1943, and perhaps the single most important individual for the Zionist settlement in Palestine, Arthur Ruppin, 1876-1943. In the background, one might add the botanist Otto Warburg from the famous Warburg banking family, 1859 to 1938, head of the Zionist Executive Committee and chairman of the Palestine Land Development Company. Let me focus here on Rupin, although in the book and other work I treat certainly Oppenheimer with great attention. He was born in Posen itself, though his family moved away when he was a child. A crisis in his family's finances forced Rupin to leave school at the age of 15. Rupin nonetheless managed to enroll in university and studied law at Berlin and Halle, but considered it a practical necessity, just like medicine was for Max Nordau and Oppenheimer. His real passion lay in political economy and social studies, and his hope was to become an expert for the betterment of society through public, but by this he means the state, service. His political leaning combined social democracy and social Darwinism. As a good German Hegelian, Rupin firmly believed in the ultimate guidance of the state, as well as the foundational place of the peasant and agriculture in the national edifice. In the 1900s, he was increasingly drawn to Zionism, and given his immense organizational gift, soon became a prominent technocrat. In 1907, he immigrated to Palestine. In 1909, established the Palestine Land Development Company, the PLDC, and also headed the Palestine office, in which capacities he was answerable to Warburg in Germany. Rupin was a founding member of Brit Shalom from the 1920s, but left it rather early. It's an interesting episode which I'm not discussing here. Before proceeding with the formative impact of the German colonization project in the Ostmark, it is important briefly to dwell on Rupin's other passion, namely race and social engineering. Rupin's role in the colonization of Palestine was so pivotal that Zionist historiography, even post-Zionist scholarship, has entitled him the father of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, which is probably correct. In addition to settlement, he was also responsible for the historical alliance within Zionism between the nationalist bourgeoisie and the labor movement, and for the agreement with the Nazis on the transfer of German Jews and their capital, in which Arlosorow too was involved, as I've already said. While a leading Zionist, he was engaged in intensive scholarly research and was considered an international authority on the social scientific study, including statistics, of the Jews. Despite considerable efforts, he never managed to master Hebrew properly. At the same time, he is presented in that historiography as a progressive official, an external expert who was apolitical. I think that this view is objectionable. Rupin's Weltanschauung, a term on which he himself insisted, was social Darwinism, and its formation occurred early on within a budding interdisciplinary paradigm that became known as eugenics or racial hygiene. One of his main mentors was a central promulgator of the new paradigm in Germany, the blonde, blue-eyed biologist Ernst Haeckel, whom Rupin described in his diary as, I quote, the marvelous German type, unquote. Haeckel's mission was to disseminate Darwinism as a Weltanschauung. From Rupin's early work in the early 1900s, it is clear that he adhered to a rigid biological determinism of race, whereby, I quote Rupin, we are connected to our predecessors not through the spiritual tradition, but through the continuity of the primordial substance that exists in our body, unquote. His reflections on the Superman, the Übermensch, made him conclude that such a man should develop only among his likes, from which conclusion the move to the purity of race needed just a nudge. What made Rupin concern himself for the rest of his life with the correction and betterment of the Jewish race, it's his term, not mine, that should be clear, of the Jewish race, was the anti-Semitic rejection from his beloved German nation and homeland. The poem entitled Without Homeland, by which Rupin penned at the nadir of his painful realization, conveys this rejection and swift passage to Zionism. It cannot be sufficiently emphasized that Rupin's path Rupin's path was typical of other Central European nominal Jews, not from Judaism to Zionism, but the other way around. Rupin's mission now was to transform the Jewish race, against his term, by renewing the purity it once knew. He explicitly follows Houston Stewart Chamberlain here, how to preserve. One of the main challenges was how to eradicate the Jews' commercial instinct, which is responsible for their excessive fondness of mammon. On this question, he adopted the thesis of the pro-Zionist economist and sociologist Werner Zombal, as mentioned, Arlosrov's advisor in the 1920s, whom he had met at Berlin University. The key for dealing with the commercial instinct, which Rupin related crucially to the Semitic element, was to preserve racial purity and eschew racial mixture, Rassenvermischung. This was systematized in Rupin's The Sociology of the Jews, which appeared first in German and promptly translated by the author Brenner into Hebrew in the early 1930s, a period in which Rupin also met for a conversation on race with Himmler's mentor, Professor Hans F.K. Günther. Rupin's diagnosis was that the original Jewish folk, the Urjude, again it's his term, which had belonged to Indo-European tribes, deteriorated because of the increasing presence of the Semitic element in its body, through intermingling with the Oriental type in particular. The Semitic component in the Jewish race gradually became dominant, extricated the Jews from nature, from their soil, and their productive agricultural way of life, and infused into them the insatiable commercial instinct as early as the First Temple era, i.e. many centuries before the first century AD. Rupin's plan to remove the Semitic component, or at least reduce its presence from the Jewish folk, since that component was dysgenic, was predicated upon identifying a human reservoir of which to effect the renewal of a purer, more Indo-Germanic Jewish race. One whose contact with its original soil would release the springs of natural sensation, Naturempfinden. That reservoir, Rupin determined, was East European Jewry, within which non-Semitic elements were discernible. Haeckel and Chamberlain looming large in his research, Rupin asserted that the Middle Eastern and Sephardi Jews were not exhibiting the same signs of eugenic renewal that was evident in their East European race relatives, and worse, they were amidst a palpable biological degeneration. He never tired of categorically underscoring the superiority of the Ashkenazis over the Mizrahim and Sfaradim in creativity, mathematical skills, hygiene, and above all, the superiority of Ashkenazi biomystic force called Lebensehnlichkeit. Roughly, I suppose one can translate it as life tenaciousness, equipped with which the folk can successfully navigate through the design kampf. All these are Rupin's and terms of this discourse, of course. I'm not inserting them into the discussion. Rupin's ultimate conclusion was that the Jewish type par excellence, the Ashkenazi Jew, was closer to the Indo-Germanic races than the Semitic ones. As I point out in my book, there were other bourgeois Jews and non-Jews, real like George Eliot and Gershom Scholem, and fictional like Daniel Deronda, from Western and Central Europe, to whom East European Jews seemed authentic. So obsessed was Rupin with race that just a few days before his death in 1943, with the Judeocide in Europe peaking, he began to write an introduction for a study on the Jewish race based on a taxonomy of noses. His samples were noses and facial features of various Zionist figures. Rupin was not just a theoretician, but also an active settler colonial official who could implement his research. From the outset of his Palestine office, his Palestine office worked with much vigor to create a community of settlers which would consist of human beings of a higher type, höher Menschentyp. He applied a strict process of selection to the candidates for immigration when they were still at their countries of origin. Statistics from 2 years, 1912 to 1914, show that the rate of those who had applied for immigration and were rejected by Rupin exceeded 80% of the applications. Even those who had been selected but contracted serious illnesses or were severely injured while in Palestine were sent back by the Palestine office to their ports of departure. One of the foremost scholars on this topic, Ethan Bloom, says Rupin's method of operation were part of his comprehensive culture planning, in the framework of which he established a network of training farms and agricultural settlements in order to facilitate the pincer movement, the control of land acquired by the Zionist movement, and the creation through intensive selection of the human matter that would form the dominant racial component of the old new Jewish race, a component he, Rupin, called the Maccabean type, unquote. To move back from race, or to move from race back to colonization and settlement, and I'm very close to the end, evidence for the extent to which the German colonization project in Posen and Eastern Prussia in general informed Rupin is both explicit and structural. On several occasions, Rupin stated his indebtedness to the German venture. In the PLDC Foundation prospectus of 1909, Rupin explained that, I quote, "In its work, the company will assume the methods used by the German Land Bank and the Prussian Colonization Commission, which are engaged in a colonization process in the East Prussian provinces," unquote. Not only were the tasks and methods of the PLDC formulated along the lines of its German Colonization Commission, even the sizes of the farms, which I quoted earlier, were identical to their Posen equivalents. Like Rupin, Warburg, the PLDC chairman, too, was unequivocal. I quote Warburg, "We do not propose new ways, new experiments whose nature is unknown. We assume instead the Prussian colonization method as it has been practiced in the last 10 years by the Colonization Commission," unquote. Reichmann and Hasson offer a meticulous survey of the structural ways, both conceptual and actual, in which the Posen model guided Rupin in particular, and the thrust of the World Zionist Organization's settlement drive before the First World War. One of the most crucial features they unwittingly uncover is what Shafir calls the pure settlement frame of mind of the World Zionist Organization experts. Reichmann and Hasson, as well as other scholars, write from a clearly Zionist perspective. The result is rather curious. Although the material they themselves furnish, and not infrequently even their own analyses, point to the contrary, something happens to the colonial model upon traveling from the Ostmark to Palestine. It ceases being colonial and mysteriously becomes something else, which is non-colonial. Two principles against the pure settlement vision which underlay Rupin colonizing approach. These in turn were congruous with the spatial concept of the German Colonization Commission. One was to avoid penetration into areas densely inhabited by another national group, and the other was to form contiguous blocks of settlements. Rupin made this patently clear in a letter to the Zionist executive headed by Warburg. I quote Rupin, "For systematic colonization, we need large contiguous areas not too far from the harbors and railroads. Such land can be found only among the large estate owners." Just the Colonization Commission in Prussia or in Germany went for the big landowners, both Polish and German. This strategy, I think, explains the big transaction with the Sursuk family of absentee landowners in Palestine, of course. Landowners, not mentioned is the fact that the indigenous tenants of the Sursuk lands in northern Palestine were then unceremoniously evicted and in large numbers. It is striking in this context how Reichmann and Hasson cannot or choose not to see that Rupin's imagination was actually guided by the colonial notion of the pure settlement colony. Let me now end with 4 literary quotations on which I offer no commentary. I just read them. First quotation. "A crusade is a war to recover the Holy Land from the paynim." Which Holy Land? Why, the Holy Land. There ain't but one. What do we want of it? Why, can't you understand? It's in the hands of the Paynim, and it's our duty to take it away from them. How did we come to let them get hold of it? We didn't come to let them get hold of it. They always had it. Why, Tom, then it must belong to them, don't it? Why, of course it does. Who said it didn't? I studied over it, but couldn't seem to get at the right of it. No way, I says. It's too many for me, Tom Sawyer. If I had a farm, and it was mine, and another person wanted it, would it be right for him to... Oh, shucks, you don't know enough to come in when it rains, Huck Finn. It ain't a farm, it's entirely different. You see, it's like this. They own the land, just the mere land, and that's all they do own. But it's our folks, our Jews and Christians, that made it holy. So they haven't any business to be there defiling it. It's a shame, and we ought not to stand for it 1 minute. We ought to march against them and take it away from them. Why, it does seem to me it's the most mixed thing I ever see. Now, if I had a farm and another person, don't I tell you, it hasn't got anything to do with farming. Farming is business, just common, low-down business. That's all it is. It's all you can say for it. But this is higher, this is religious and totally different. Religious to go and take the land away from the people that owns it? Certainly, it's always been considered so. Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer Abroad, 1894. Second quotation. They, the Arabs surrounding the camp in Palestine, reminded me much of Indians, did these people. They had but little clothing, but such as they had was fanciful in character and fantastic in its arrangement. Any little absurd gewgaw or gimcrack they had, they disposed in such a way as to attract attention most readily. They sat in silence and with tireless patience watched our every motion with that vile, uncomplaining impoliteness which is so truly Indian, and which makes the white man so nervous and uncomfortable and savage that he wants to exterminate the whole tribe. Mark Twain, Innocents Abroad, 1872. Third quotation. The new Jews were no more familiar to me than the old kind, perhaps less. They were just the opposite, but I never saw them. They were not to be seen in Jerusalem. They were far away. They breathed in the Kibutzim, in the Palmach, in the Negev and Galilee, always elsewhere. They were tough and blonde and tender and powerful and uncomplicated. They toiled over the land all day and in the evening made wild love to the kibbutz girls. And then later at night picked up their submachine guns and dashed out to smash the hostile Red Indians or Arabs before calling it a day. Amos Oz, Imagining the Other, 1993. Fourth and final quotation. We bring you civilization, said the stranger. We are the masters of time, come to inherit this land of yours. March in Indian file so we can tally you on the face of the lake, corpse by corpse. Keep marching so the Gospels may thrive. We want God all to ourselves, because the best Indians are dead Indians in the eyes of our Lord. Mahmoud Darwish, Speech of the Red Indian, 1992. Thank you. Two steps. I shall first give a succinct account of what comparative settler colonialism is all about and place the Zionist Israeli project within that context. In the second step, I shall dwell on two major Zionist figures, Chaim Arlozorov and Arthur Rupin, and show that the consciousness evinced by their intellectual and political work was one of white settlers. I think that the best way deeply to understand Zionism and the state of Israel is comparative settler colonialism. The buoyant field of comparative settler colonialism has produced some of the most penetrating new studies of these societies over the past few decades. Their starting point is the recognition that from the 16th century on, European expansion and conquest produced two related but clearly distinguishable forms of colonialism. One was metropole colonialism, in which the European powers conquered and ruled vast territories, but without the emigration there of Europeans seeking to make these territories their national home. British India is a good example. The other type was settler colonialism, in which conquest brought with it substantial waves of European settlers who, with the passage of time, sought to make the colony their national patrimony. This process entailed a relationship with the indigenous people that could range from dispossession to elimination, or from slavery, which for the most part did not use the native population, to cheap labor, depending on the economic and social formation of the given settler situation. The achievements of the comparative study of settler colonialism have been at once scholarly and political. Many settler projects gave birth to powerful nation-states, which have asserted their hegemonic narratives nationally and internationally. The comparative field not only acutely questions these narratives through countervailing evidence and interpretation, it also offers an alternative, transformative account of the social formations themselves. In the process, three fundamental features common to these hegemonic settler narratives are undermined. The first of these is the putative uniqueness, was the late Baruch Kimmerling's Zionism and Territory in 1983. Kimmerling was a sociologist of the Hebrew University. A decade later, in his magisterial Land, Labor, and the Origins of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, Gershon Shafir, another Israeli sociologist who has been teaching for a long time at UCSD, Gershon Shafir brought the method of comparative settler colonialism to bear upon the early phase of Zionist colonization from 1882 to 1914, and later upon the nature of the Israeli state itself. Shafir demonstrated that although certain features were historically specific to Zionism, it is nonetheless perfectly comparable to other settler projects, and that what shaped the nature and institutions of the Jewish colonization of Palestine were not just the project's intrinsic ideologies, but the settler-indigene struggle itself. Shafir underscored the distinction between metropole and settler colonialisms and helped to refine the taxonomy of the latter, of settler colonialism, in particular of each settler nation. The second, their privileging of the settler nations, their privileging of the settlers' intentions as sovereign subjects at the expense of the native consciousness and at the expense of the consequences of colonization. Third is the supposed inconsequence of natives to the form each settler society takes. In other words, the conflict with the natives is not denied, but the fundamental role that this conflict has played in shaping the identity of the settler nation is written out. It is within the typology of settler colonialism that I place the Zionist colonization of Palestine and the State of Israel, a move which surely should put to rest the tedious contention that Zionism could not be termed a colonial venture because it lacked the features of metropole colonialism, as if anyone were suggesting otherwise. What Zionist apologists fail to confront is the settler colonial paradigm. I am by no means the first to suggest it. The pioneer analysis of Zionist Israel as a settler project Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be in Berlin. It's one of my favorite towns, cities in the world. I'm grateful to the CMO, to Sonia and to Mark, my colleague and friend, for inviting me. It's a big honor, and I'm very grateful, Mark, for your very gracious introduction. This is an auspicious moment for me to present this work because I'm between two projects. As Mark said, the book on Zionism appeared, and I started work on this book that, for the moment, tentatively I'm entitling The Culture of Settler Societies, within which Israel and Zionism will figure, but it will not be as monographic as the previous one. What I want to talk about today is the Zionist colonization of Palestine in the context of comparative settler colonialism. I'd like to present my argument in